The engine is still running, not because anyone forgot to turn it off, not because of carelessness, because outside this truck right now, the temperature has dropped to 54 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and if that engine goes cold, it may never start again. You're looking at a Kenworth T6080 parked just off the gravel shoulder somewhere north of the Yukon River crossing, on a stretch of road most Americans have never heard of and would never choose to drive. The sky is the kind of black that doesn't exist in cities. Not dark, black. No streetlights, no other vehicles in either direction. No cell signal. Just the low growl of an engine that cannot stop, and somewhere inside that cab, behind a curtain dividing the driver's seat from the bunk, a professional driver is sleeping. Most people, if they heard that scenario, would ask the same question. How? Not how does he stay warm? Not what kind of equipment keeps the heater running? But how, psychologically, does a human being close their eyes and let go when outside? There is nothing between them and a landscape that would kill them within minutes without shelter. The answer isn't simple. And it doesn't start in the sleeper cab. It starts 500 miles south in Fairbanks, Alaska, at 6 o'clock in the morning, when a driver named Carleal Transportation has already been awake for an hour, checking something most people would never think to check. The fuel. The Dalton Highway, which truckers call the Haul Road, is 414 miles of mostly gravel running from Livingood, 84 miles north of Fairbanks, all the way to Deadhorse on the edge of the Arctic Ocean. It was built in 1974, originally in just 5 months, to supply the construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline and the Prudhoe Bay oil fields. For the first 20 years of its existence, it was closed to private vehicles entirely. It was never designed as a public road. It was designed as an industrial supply line, and that is exactly what it still is. The trucks that run it are not doing it for adventure. They are doing it because the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay, which produce oil from the largest field in North American history, need a continuous supply of equipment, fuel, machinery, food, and materials. When the Dalton Highway closes due to weather, losses run to an estimated $1 million a day. Every load matters. Every run matters. And every run begins with a decision about fuel that most people would not consider a decision at all. Diesel fuel contains paraffin wax. In normal temperatures, that wax stays in liquid suspension, moving through fuel lines and filters without incident. But when temperatures drop below 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, that wax begins to crystallize. The crystals bind together, thicken the fuel, clog the filters, and in the worst cases, shut the engine down entirely. Not in a dramatic way, not with a bang or a warning light, but quietly, gradually until the fuel simply stops flowing and the engine dies. On the Dalton Highway in January at 50 below, a dead engine is not an inconvenience. It is a life-threatening emergency. There is no cell signal for most of the route. The nearest service is a place called Coldfoot. Population 13 people, 250 miles north of Fairbanks. The stretch of highway north of Coldfoot runs 240 miles without any services at all. That is the longest service gap on any public road in North America. So the fuel check is not casual. Experienced Dalton drivers running the route in deep winter switch from standard number 2 diesel to winterized blends that mix number 1 diesel, a kerosene-based formulation with significantly less paraffin wax, with anti-gel additives that can lower the cold filter plugging point to negative 65 degrees Fahrenheit. The trucks themselves run with extra-large fuel tanks specifically sized to complete a round trip to Prudhoe Bay, and back with enough reserve to idle for several days if they get stranded. Because getting stranded is not hypothetical on this road. It happens. When it does, the engine cannot be shut off, because a cold-soaked diesel engine at 50 below may not restart at all, regardless of how much fuel is in the tank. The preparation continues before the driver ever climbs in. Block heaters, plugged into shore power at the truck terminal in Fairbanks, have been running all night to keep the engine block warm. Coolant heaters circulate heated fluid through the engine even when it isn't running. The APU, the auxiliary power unit, a separate small diesel engine mounted on the outside of the cab behind the sleeper, has also been running, maintaining cabin temperature through the night so that by the time the driver climbs in, the sleeper is already warm. Not warm like a house. Warm like a deliberate engineered environment calibrated for survival in an environment where survival is not guaranteed. The Carlisle Transportation and Linden Transport Companies, two of the main carriers operating the Dalton, outfit all of their sleeper cabs with APUs as standard equipment. This isn't a luxury feature, it's an operational necessity. An APU burns between 1/10 gallon of diesel per hour, dramatically less than idling the main engine, which consumes far more fuel and causes measurably more engine wear over time. On a long winter run to Deadhorse, the difference between running the main engine overnight and running the APU is not just fuel cost. It's the mechanical lifespan of an engine that has to start reliably in some of the coldest conditions on Earth, potentially for years. The math of that decision runs through every driver's head long before they cross the Arctic Circle. The road out of Fairbanks is deceptive in the first 50 miles. There is still daylight, or what passes for daylight in January at this latitude. A low, pale light that barely clears the horizon before it begins to fall again. By the time a driver reaches Coldfoot, 250 miles north, that light has been gone for hours. Near the winter solstice, Coldfoot receives only a few hours of weak grayish illumination each day. The sun doesn't climb above the horizon at all for several weeks. This is not darkness in the way most people experience darkness, a temporary condition between sunset and sunrise. This is a different thing altogether. A darkness that settles in for months, broken only by the narrow beam of headlights and the occasional green sweep of the northern lights. Driving in that darkness on an unlit gravel road, in a vehicle that weighs up to 80,000 pounds fully loaded, with no guardrails and a road surface that shifts between packed snow, glare ice, and graded gravel depending on the weather of the last 48 hours, requires a level of concentration that most professional drivers describe as exhausting, in a way that is difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. The fatigue is not the fatigue of boredom. It is the fatigue of sustained vigilance, of reading a road that is constantly communicating information through the steering wheel, through the sounds of the tires, through the subtle behavior of the trailer behind you. Experienced Dalton drivers say you feel ice before you see it. The truck tells you, a slight loosening of traction underfoot, a change in steering resistance, and the response has to be calibrated, not reactive, because on this road, a sudden overcorrection at highway speed is more dangerous than the ice itself. At mile marker 244 of the Dalton Highway, the road climbs Atigun Pass, elevation 4,822 feet above sea level, in the heart of the Brooks Range. Grades of 11 to 12%. The only road crossing through the entire Brooks Mountain Range in Alaska. In summer, it's demanding. In winter, it's where every Dalton driver focuses their entire professional existence for however long it takes to get over it. The weight of a loaded trailer changes everything on a grade like that. Going up, the engine is working at its limits. Going down, the brakes are working at their limits, and in icy conditions, the brakes are only part of the solution. Engine braking, careful gear management, controlled descent. These are the skills that separate drivers who run Atigun once and never come back from the ones who run it season after season. The road has seen rollovers. It has seen jackknives. The steep grades combined with icy conditions and improperly balanced loads have sent trucks off the road in ways that are not always recoverable. There are no barriers in most sections. Beyond the road edge is Alaska, raw, indifferent, and very far from help. On the far side of Atigun, the landscape opens into the Arctic coastal plain. The Brooks Range disappears behind you. Ahead, the road runs through tundra, so flat that on clear days you can see for dozens of miles in every direction, which means the wind can also see you and hit you with nothing to slow it down for hundreds of miles. Wind on the Dalton north of the Brooks Range can gust to 60 miles an hour at -40 ambient temperature. That creates wind chills that move the effective temperature deep into ranges where exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes. Drivers have learned not to step outside without full Arctic gear no matter how brief the stop. A tire problem, a chained-up load that needs checking. Anything requiring physical work outside the cab is now a risk that needs to be managed like a separate operation, with gear pulled out, layers added, exposure time calculated. This is the context in which the driver parks and tries to sleep. Federal regulations require a 30-minute break after 8 hours of driving and a 10-hour off-duty rest period before the next shift begins. These regulations exist for every commercial driver in the country, and they apply on the Dalton just as they apply anywhere else. But following them on the Dalton in winter creates a problem that drivers on most other routes never face. You can't always choose when to stop. You can't always choose where. A mandatory rest period doesn't pause because the weather has turned, or because you've just come over Atigun and the first available wide spot is exposed to 40-mile-an-hour winds. You work with what's available. Experienced drivers know the Dalton well enough to plan stops strategically. A pullout at a known wide section, a spot south of a ridge that provides some wind shelter, a position where the truck can park safely and the APU exhaust won't back up into the cab. This knowledge is earned over years of runs. It is not in any manual. The sleeper cab itself is a carefully designed environment. Modern long-haul sleepers, the kind used by companies running the Dalton, typically measure between 72 and 80 inches in length behind the driver's seat, with a ceiling high enough to stand partially upright. There is a bunk, usually with a mattress that most drivers replace with higher quality foam after their first few months on the road. There are storage compartments above and below. There is a refrigerator, often a microwave. There is a curtain between the bunk and the driver's compartment. And experienced Arctic drivers often add insulated privacy curtains that research has shown can reduce the heating load on the sleeper section by up to 26% in cold conditions, which at 50 below is not a small number. That 26% difference in heat retention means the APU doesn't have to work as hard, which means it burns less fuel, which means the margin of fuel reserve stays larger. The temperature inside a properly equipped sleeper with an APU running stays in the range of 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what's happening outside. That's the engineering goal. But engineering goals exist on paper. In practice, a sleeper cab is a metal box with windows and seals that age and crack. Heat moves through gaps around door frames, through windows that aren't perfectly sealed, through the floor where cold from the chassis migrates upward. Every experienced cold weather driver knows the cold spots in their specific truck, the way a homeowner knows the drafts in an old house. They keep a sleeping bag rated for temperatures well below zero. Not because they expect to need it, but because they might. On the Dalton, backup plans are not pessimism. They are professionalism. The sound inside a parked truck in deep Arctic cold is something drivers describe in ways that take a moment to absorb. The APU runs with a low mechanical drone, different in pitch from the main engine, a sound that becomes so familiar it stops registering consciously after a few weeks on the road. Outside, at 50 below with wind, there is a high, thin sound that comes through even well-sealed cab walls. Metal contracts in extreme cold and makes sounds. Clicks, groans, small pops. The trailer behind the cab shifts slightly as temperatures change. The tires, hardened by the cold, have lost some of their pressure, which the driver will need to check before moving again in the morning. Rubber becomes significantly stiffer at low temperatures, and a tire that read 70 pounds per square inch when loaded in Fairbanks will read lower after sitting at 50 below for 8 hours. Every experienced cold weather driver accounts for this. It's part of the pre-departure checklist that non-drivers would never anticipate. North of the Brooks Range, in winter, Dead Horse is 55 days of polar darkness. No sun above the horizon from late November through mid-January. The temperature at Dead Horse, which sits on the shore of the Arctic Ocean, has been recorded as low as 56 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The population of the town hovers around 25 permanent residents, though the non-permanent worker population from the oil operations reaches into the thousands. There are no public bars. There are no restaurants open to the general public. The facilities that exist are industrial. The bumper sticker sold at the Arctic Caribou Inn captures it without embellishment. Dead Horse, Alaska. All that far and still no bar. For the truck drivers who make the run from Fairbanks to Dead Horse and back, roughly 1,000 miles round trip, this is the destination. Not a destination anyone would choose for its comforts. The drivers who run this route are not doing it because they have no other options. The Dalton Highway requires specialized experience, specific equipment, and a willingness to operate in conditions that most professional drivers, people who are already among the most capable vehicle operators on Earth, would decline. The carriers that run it actively recruit for it. The pay reflects the conditions, but the drivers who stay on this route, who run it season after season, describe something harder to quantify than compensation. The Dalton operates on a culture of mutual responsibility that doesn't exist in the same way on other routes. When a truck breaks down at 50 below, the next truck to come along stops. Not because there's a rule requiring it, because in this environment, the alternative is unthinkable. That ethic, looking out for the person in the cab ahead of you, runs through everything. Inside the sleeper, somewhere between Coldfoot and Dead Horse, at 3 in the morning, the driver sleeps. Not because conditions are ideal, not because there is any comfort available in the conventional sense, but because the body needs rest to function, and the function required tomorrow, navigating a road that will not forgive errors, demands that the rest be taken seriously. This is one of the things that separates the professionals who run extreme routes from everyone else. Not just the skill, the discipline of recovery, the understanding that fatigue is as real a hazard as ice and needs to be managed with the same deliberate attention. The 10-hour rest period is not a regulation to be resented. On the Dalton in winter, it is a survival strategy that was eventually formalized into law. What the driver carries with them, beyond the fuel additives, the spare parts, the Arctic survival kit in the back of the cab, the sleeping bag rated for -30, the food for several days in case of a closure, is something that doesn't appear in any equipment list. It's a particular form of earned calm, not indifference to danger, not recklessness. The opposite of recklessness. It is a capacity, built over years of runs on difficult roads, to accurately assess what is dangerous and what only feels dangerous, and to respond to both without the interference of panic. The drivers who stay on the Dalton are the ones who learned, at some point, that fear is useful information, but a poor decision maker. The ones who respond to the information fear provides and then set the fear aside long enough to sleep. The coldest temperature ever recorded in the United States was at Prospect Camps, 39 miles south of Coldfoot, in 1971, 80 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. That record stands. The Dalton runs through that country. The trucks that supply Prudhoe Bay run through that country, winter after winter, load after load, year after year. The pipeline that runs alongside the highway for much of its length carries oil that powers the country. The trucks that run beside it carry what the people who maintain that pipeline need to live and work. And the drivers inside those trucks sleep because they have to, because they know how to, and because in the morning there is still several hundred miles of road between where they are and where they need to be. The next time you stop at a gas station and the pump delivers fuel in 15 seconds, without drama, without interruption, it's worth considering what the supply chain behind that moment looks like at its most extreme edge. What it looks like at 50 below, in polar night, on a gravel road above the Arctic Circle, beside a Trans-Alaska pipeline that nobody outside the industry thinks about, in a truck that hasn't turned its engine off since Fairbanks. The driver inside that truck is sleeping, professionally, deliberately, And when the alarm goes off, they will run a checklist. Fuel, tires, brakes, APU, visibility, and put the truck back on the road. Because the Prudhoe Bay oil fields don't pause for weather, and neither do the people who supply them. What happens when that discipline encounters something the checklist doesn't cover? When a driver encounters wildfire smoke so thick that the road ahead simply disappears, belongs to a different story entirely. And that story is coming.